I didn't really plan to spend my last 9 years spending so many days working on open primaries. But anyway, I am where I am, and so I'm very proud of my effort.
Dee Knudson there of Open Primaries, South Dakota, the group working to enfranchise independent voters in state primary elections. That issue will be on the ballot again this year in 2024, though in different form than 8 years ago, when it came up 10 points short.
Well, we learned a valuable lesson in 2016, one that I wish the election reform industry would learn, that trying to do too much too fast makes it much more difficult.
Joe Kirby, also a director of this effort, he's a business entrepreneur who helped bring innovation to city government in Sioux Falls 3 decades ago, and has spent the last decade working to bring change to South Dakota elections.
I must say that after we lost in 2016, I kind of thought maybe that might be enough for that project for me.
We tried to do two things at once. We tried to bring open primaries to South Dakota. At the same time, we tried to remove party labels.
But I really love South Dakota. I care lots about government. I'm a former city councilor. I just knew that I didn't have a choice. I had to give this one more shot, and I really am confident that we will win this on November 5th.
I'm Robert Pease, and this is The Purple Principle, podcast on the perils of polarization, discussing open primaries in South Dakota this episode with Dee Knudson and Joe Kirby. Despite that failure back in 2016, they're incredibly confident about passing Amendment H in 2024. And if passed, this would create a single unified primary of all candidates, open to all voters, Republican, Democrat, and Independent, from which the top 2 finishers advance to the general election. In many state elections in South Dakota, that'll mean 2 Republican candidates competing in that general election because registered Republicans do outnumber Democrats 2-1. But in the current state Senate elections, the vast majority of Republican candidates, they run unopposed in general elections. So changes in the air in this deeply conservative state and truly competitive elections may be on the horizon in South Dakota, as in many other states in 2024. On this broader trend, we have commentary this episode from the founder and president of the national organization, Open Primaries, John Updike. He's one of America's foremost election reformers, and he explains why this year's crop of state-level reform initiatives is more robust, more diverse, and potentially more impactful.
And part of what I think is so healthy is that the national groups are saying, hey, let us show you our research. Let us show you what this looks like from up looking down. And the local people say, great, that's really helpful. Let us show you what our local polling looks like. Let us show you what our political culture looks like.
Updike founded Open Primaries in 2009 and has worked on dozens of ballot initiatives and legislative reform efforts in dozens of states.
And it's why I think there's so many different forms of open primaries that are moving forward in the country right now, because it's not driven by a purely local conversation, nor is it driven by a purely national conversation. It's the hybrid of these things that is creating dynamism and experimentation and innovation.
Opening primaries in South Dakota this episode, to approximately 150,000 unaffiliated or independent voters, a larger number than registered Democrats in this GOP-dominated state. They're doing things their way in Pierre, Sioux Falls, and out on the plains, and also receiving national coverage for it from ABC News and the New York Times.
Yes, actually a reporter from North Dakota contacted me, and I did a long interview with him. I believe Joe was interviewed on that at that time also, and then that story was the story that went to ABC News.
Now, you had an earlier effort, I believe in 2016, to also open primaries. What is different about the environment today for this type of election reform? For example, is there more press coverage?
Well, actually, we had quite a bit of coverage then also, but a major difference last time from this time is that the last time the group decided to try to take off the party labels. And we, it was a difficult decision, but that was what the team decided. And we actually lost that election by 10 percentage points. But we taught many people about open primaries during that time.
So, Joe, you're feeling that this is a continuation of that effort, even though you've perhaps scaled it down or refined it a bit?
Well, we learned a valuable lesson in 2016, and I see the analogies to the efforts around the country where they're trying to bring open primaries plus ranked choice voting, and I wish them the best, but I think the lesson South Dakota learned is don't do too much too fast. We're confident, and we feel like the stars are really aligned for open primaries this year in South Dakota, because not only is it a simpler sell, but so many things have lined up in our favor. For instance, the primary election turnout was a record low of 17% a couple weeks ago. And the political system is breaking. The mainstream Republicans in our single-party state are not sure what to do. The battles between them and the MAGA groups and others, they've kind of lost control of the steering wheel. And here we are with a possible solution to restore some rationality to politics.
Now, Dee and Joe, do you consider yourselves Republicans at this point?
Yes, we are both registered Republicans. I think Joe might be a little bit more of a Republican than I am, but we are both Republicans.
I voted for Donald Trump twice, so I'm the funniest looking Democrat you've ever met.
What then do you hope for this open primaries initiative?
Well, like I said in the New York Times, I want our election system to produce elected officials who reflect South Dakota values, not the values of the 17% that show up to vote in primaries. There's a big difference between those two groups. Regular South Dakotans have values that are more in sync with traditional Republican values.
And also, I would just like to add that we actually want to encourage more engagement by our voters in South Dakota. And the state of South Dakota predicts that more than 50,000 more people will vote after we pass open primaries. And that's kind of what I call democracy, when you're encouraging more people and making it easier for people to vote in a meaningful election.
So tell us about signature gathering this time versus 2016. Was that any easier, and is it easier to raise money? There's so many reform efforts around the country. We're wondering, has the environment changed in these 8 years?
Well, I would say that, for one thing, since this is an education effort, that we were able to pick up more circulators this time because they'd done it before. So they know the topic better and they know how to circulate, and they're more confident, asking their friends and strangers too to sign our petitions. And so actually, I would say that the effort as far as collecting signatures probably went a little bit more smoothly. It is still a Herculean task. And anyway, we are very proud of all of our circulators throughout South Dakota who worked hard making this possible.
10% of our signatures came from volunteers, 90% from a paid effort. And the paid effort was mostly paid for by South Dakotans. It is harder to chase national dollars these days. There's so many election reform proposals in front of half a dozen or more states, and most of them are using the combined ranked choice voting open primaries model that seems to be more popular these days with the election reform industry.
And we actually very much know that the reform of the current system has to come from voters. It obviously is never going to come from political parties. It has to come from people like us who are committed to improving democracy in South Dakota.
Well, how about your own personal conversations with friends, colleagues, perhaps some fundraising conversations, or with people in the legislature? Any different today than in 2016?
Very much so. A lot of legislators, a lot of Republicans, mainstream Republicans, including some of our congressional delegation, are quietly supportive this time because they see the divisiveness in national politics, but also within their party. And they see that by broadening the base, the number of voters that can participate, we're going to get back toward more rationality in our politics.
Joe, you said quietly supportive. Does that mean they privately say, we hope this passes, but they won't publicly endorse it?
Absolutely. It's not in their best interest to publicly support it. If a Republican politician were to come out and support it, they get attacked from the far right. And so we don't even press them to support us. We just ask them not to oppose us. And that's pretty much the demeanor of most of the politicians and elected officials I talk to, is that they hope this succeeds because it'll restore normal politics, but they can't say so out loud.
Dee, have you had any conversations like that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, actually, that happens quite often. I recently visited with a high-ranking legislator in South Dakota who made it clear to me that he would not be bad-mouthing open primaries in any fashion. And actually, that is a very long list of people, both Republicans and Democrats, who they realize now that, frankly, the only hope for South Dakota is open primaries. I mean, because we have to fix the broken structure. If we don't do that, we're going to continue to elect more and more fringe candidates, and that is not what South Dakota wants.
After this last primary, I had one of the legislative leaders, Republicans, contact me by text, and he said, "I've decided you're right. I'd like to help. Let me know whether you want me to campaign for you or against you."
And what did you decide?
I just said, we'll let you know.
We're speaking with Dee Knudson and Joe Kirby on the South Dakota Open Primaries initiative that is officially called Amendment H. Compared to 2016, this year's effort is getting less opposition from the Republican Party, which controls politics at all levels in this state. But lack of opposition, that's not the same as public support. And John Opdyke, president of Open Primaries, he's observed the same phenomenon in many states throughout the country over many election cycles. And he suggests 2024 could be the tipping point, and a significant number of elected representatives from both parties finally begin to publicly promote the election reforms that they do privately support.
2024 is going to be an important year. There's a lot of referendums on the ballot. There's legislation in multiple states. There's opportunities to really change the narrative on this. And I think that one of the consequences is that more and more elected officials will come out and support it. What happens now is you get these elected officials that once they retire, once they announce their retirement, then they're like, we need this. We need open primaries. But while they're, seeking re-election, they won't. And I think we'll start to see that change. But that's on us. That's not on them. Politicians just do what's in their self-interest.
That's certainly the case nationwide, all levels of government. Elected officials operate so obviously in their own best interests, especially during election years. But they do need voter support to sustain those operations, and they must attract votes in different cultural environments. So we asked Joe Kirby and Dee Knudson about the political culture of South Dakota and how this revised 2024 Open Primaries Amendment plays to traditional South Dakota values.
Well, first of all, I'd like to proudly announce that South Dakota was the first state to South Dakota founded initiatives and referendum process. So that's kind of special, I think. That was like around 1898. But anyway, is that I just think that almost everyone realizes that we are not electing people right now who represent South Dakota values. I mean, we're far from that. And each year, each election is getting worse and worse and worse. And so as far as the culture is concerned, it's like, this is just encouraging for many people. I mean, that many people think whether they want to get real involved or just stay quiet or whatever, they're really, I think, very proud of our effort.
So the South Dakota values that I think of when I think of traditional South Dakota values are small government, freedom, democracy, individual rights. And when you talk about those kinds of values, how offensive it is to have closed primaries where the government says you can't vote in our election, your state-sponsored elections, and only 17% of the people show up. That has nothing to do with democracy or freedom or individual rights. We got to get back to valuing those rights, which I consider very conservative values and also very Republican values.
And our effort is extremely bipartisan. I mean, our board of directors is bipartisan. Our advisory committee of representatives throughout South Dakota, we have many we have many Republicans and Democrats and independents, and we all know each other. We're all government, we're well-informed government people, and we are really working nicely together as we always do in South Dakota.
So there is this civility that you mentioned, Dee, that you could conceivably walk into a radio station and ask if you could use a microphone. Is there still any civility in the legislature? Can you approach your legislator with a request, or has that civility eroded over time?
No, absolutely. In South Dakota, we really do feel very comfortable doing that. I mean, my husband, for instance, is a former state senator and once ran for governor of South Dakota. I mean, it's like we all know each other. We're all very comfortable being ourselves and asking for those kinds of favors like, hey, I need a recording studio, But anyway, and so we're very comfortable asking our current legislators for help. And again, it's just that, as Joe already said, there are many legislators that right now are just worried about saving themselves as far as their spot in the legislature. And I respect that thinking. I always wish that some of them had a little bit more courage. But anyway, I realize that's reality.
Well, we've been talking to election reformers in Idaho. They have an effort there to both open primaries and create ranked choice voting. And they talk about the legislature there being constantly involved in culture wars and not paying attention to more significant issues. Has that been the case at all in South Dakota?
Yes, but I am glad to announce that this last legislative session, the legislators and the governor worked more closely together than they had previously and so forth. But I do believe that the current legislature spends more time on minor topics than it used to. And I know with open primaries, we will start electing a different level of government officials who will start dealing more with the real topics that need to be handled.
And there are 6 or 7 issues that are going to be ballot issues that are going to be on our November ballot this year. And to me, that shows a disconnect between what the legislature does and what the voters want. The fact that the voters have to bring forward so many issues every time. In fact, we average about 6 every election cycle. That shows that they are not doing what we want in Pierre. At least there are some things that we wish they were doing that they're not.
Could you give us some examples of some of those initiatives that are on the ballot this year that really should have been handled in the legislature?
Well, for the 3rd time, we're going to be voting on recreational marijuana. We passed it once. It was thrown out by the court system. We faced it again 2 years ago and didn't pass it. Now the marijuana people are coming back with a harder sales pitch this year. And like much of the country, we're going to be talking about abortion rights. And our legislature has gone to an extreme position of basically barring abortion. And so now the proposal put forward is fairly liberal. So we're going to swing from one to the other if we follow the lead of other states. A lot of conservative states, as you know, have passed abortion rights. And in fact, I think everyone that's faced it. So if the legislature would do its job, we would have some sort of abortion rule that maybe is in sync with the middle point, which would be South Dakota values.
Joe Kirby and Dee Knudson, directors of South Dakota Open Primaries. They've submitted signatures and received validation from the state for the Amendment H ballot initiative. Again, this would create a single unified primary open to all voters and candidates from which the top 2 finishers advance to the general election. That's currently the model in both the states of Washington and California. And our hope in South Dakota is that open primaries leading to more competitive general elections will foster a less ideological, more pragmatic legislature. That's a concern and a hope echoed by many election reformers in our current series, including Luke Mayville, co-founder of Reclaim Idaho.
For years now, as we've talked to people about different issues, whether it was healthcare or funding for public education, there was a recurring theme where people would mention that this ballot initiative process is really the only way that they feel they have a voice in the political process. And that always left us with the thought of, well, isn't that itself a serious problem? Because as a voter, shouldn't you have a voice in your ordinary election process? It shouldn't take an initiative to address every issue.
We'll hear a similar concern in our upcoming episode with Paul Johnson and Chuck Coughlin of Make Elections Fair AZ, as in Arizona. That's another group poised to place the open primaries issue on the ballot this year.
People who we elect to solve our problems at the legislature, as Paul just suggested, that we're putting into the room, it's not getting any better. We're getting worse and worse outputs and much more conflict-oriented, much more deeply partisan. And on issues like water, which are critical to Arizona's long-term success, we don't have statesmen in the room anymore. We don't have people that can see the wisdom of compromise on issues.
Major issues do vary from state to state and session to session, but so many state legislatures around the country have been caught up in the same culture war debates at the expense of more fundamental issues. That's been fueling broad support for election reform in many states this year, South Dakota included. In fact, the internal polling that Joe Kirby and Dee Knudson have commissioned, that shows this year's amendment running 20 points higher than the more ambitious version that was proposed 8 years ago. And that may have something to do with the lack of public opposition to the initiative from the state's dominant party, the GOP.
I think what we're really finding, and it's a surprise, we're not getting much opposition or pushback. No one has spoken against this recently that I've seen, except a couple Democrat leaders who are bucking their party position of not taking a position. So the head of the Republican Party a few months ago said a few things against it. But I think over time, as people get comfortable with the concept, and we've been talking about it since we started gathering signatures in 2022, people have gotten used to the ideas, and I think there's less and less opposition. There's less fear about what it'll mean. And I think a lot of people consider it a return toward normal politics. And that's because we're talking about just open primaries. We're not talking about ranking, which the Republicans nationally, irrationally, in my view, are violently opposed to ranked choice voting.
Yes, well, there certainly have been a number of legislatures that have passed laws against ranked choice voting. I was thinking about a quote from South Dakota's GOP chairman, Senator John
Wick. He's the gentleman that spoke against us a couple times, but when he's been contacted for recent articles, he has been no comment.
Yes, especially after the disastrous primary for the Republicans, when 14 establishment candidates lost, is that Senator Wick has been noticeably quite quiet.
So tell us about that primary result. The more traditional mainstream conservative wing, they lost badly to the MAGA wing?
Yes.
Well, a number of incumbents that expected to be reelected were thrown out. They were surprised, and they attribute it to low voter turnout.
And what about from the governor's office, lieutenant governor, secretary of state? Have they taken any position on it?
They have not. We've attempted to engage, but have not had a conversation with them.
And so they haven't spoken out against it?
No.
Is that different from back in 2016?
Yes. The governor back in 2016 financed, in large degree, the campaign against us, and one of his staff members led that campaign.
Anything else of importance that we've missed about the effort, about submission, ratification, any other important signposts on the way here?
No, I like to say that the stars are aligned for open primaries right now, and it truly seems to be the case that so many things have fallen into place. The opposition is diminished. I think there's a realization that closed primaries simply don't make sense when you're in a single party state. I mean, I can make a good argument for why closed primaries made sense in the past when we had two parties, but with one party, it just doesn't make sense.
And I would just like to add that I am confident that open primaries will strengthen democracy in South Dakota, just without a doubt. I'm just positive about that. And I also think that open primaries will foster a more representative and functional government. And that is just a very exciting thought for me personally.
Dee Knudson and Joe Kirby, directors of South Dakota Open Primaries, on their effort to create more competitive primary and general elections and more pragmatic governance in the very first state to have adopted the citizen ballot initiative process over a century ago. We'll be checking back in with Dee and Joe this November to see how Amendment H does fare at the polls. Next up, though, we're headed south and west to the decidedly purple, unpredictable state of Arizona and a very different open primaries ballot measure. This effort is led by longtime Republican strategist Chuck Coughlin and the former Democratic Phoenix mayor and gubernatorial candidate Paul Johnson, who's now a political independent.
So the open primary issue is not certainly a new issue, neither is ranked choice voting for that matter. We've been working on this issue for a variety of decades.
Like Dee Knudson and Joe Kirby in South Dakota, Paul Johnson's been a dedicated election reform advocate for over a decade. His efforts could come to fruition this year.
But this thing has become dramatically different in the last 4 to 5 years. What I would say are the biggest effects are people who are beginning to increasingly feel like they're left out of the system. People who no longer want to register as a Democrat or as a Republican because they feel that the parties just simply don't represent them. If you look at the numbers on that, about 49% of the country identify as an independent. In Arizona, it's been the largest voting bloc of people inside of our state. In general, independents and unaffiliated voters represent more people than both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party.
On this Arizona episode, we'll again have commentary from John Updike, president of Open Primaries.
And I think if it's successful, a lot of people around the country are going to look to Arizona as a model they want to emulate in some form or fashion. Because what they've done is they've said, we're going to have nonpartisan primaries. All voters are treated the same. All candidates are treated the same. We're going to combine that with opening the presidential primaries to independent voters. And if the parties don't like that, they can pay for the primaries themselves.
We hope you'll tune into that episode, share us on social media, and subscribe to our YouTube page for video highlights from all the episodes in this nonpartisan state election reform series. Purple Principle is created by a talented team of audio reformers: Kevin A. Klein, senior audio engineer; Vienna Maglio, bookings and field producer; Trevor Profit, digital ops and strategy; Mary Claire Cogler, video production; and Jason Tomzak, fact-checking and research. Purple Principle is a Fluent Knowledge production. Original music by Ryan Adair Rooney.